In the entire civilized world, a parliament is not just a beautiful building for passing laws, but first and foremost a platform for seeking compromise, a forum for political forces, a place to express one's own point of view, to protect the interests of various social groups, as well as a place to discuss projects for the development of the state, and a venue for the clash of different views and approaches. In the end, parliament is a symbol of freedom of speech, without which a normal, competitive political life is simply impossible. In the Russian Federation, as everyone knows, everything is ass backwards. That's why the Russian parliament is not an independent branch of power, but simply an appendage of the ruling Chekist mafia regime, a relic of Yeltsin's pseudo-democracy, which for the last 20 to 25 years has played a purely ceremonial role. Similar to the Reichstag in Hitler's Germany or the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, just for show, just to have it. That's why today we'll talk about the upcoming elections to the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation, which will take place in September of this year. What is the direct and hidden meaning of these elections? My name is Semyon. This is the Mega Show TV channel. Let's get down to business. The Duma is not a place for discussions. It's no secret to anyone that for more than 20 years the State Duma has not been a legislative body with at least some independent ambitions and political will, but simply an obedient tool. A tool in the hands of the presidential administration and of the Tsar himself personally. A tool for rubber-stamping pre-prepared laws. That is, legitimizing decisions of national importance that have already been made in secret in the warm Kremlin offices. The last time the State Duma made any serious decisions can be roughly dated to 2003, when Putin still didn't have a pack of trained dogs called United Russia. And in the early years of his reign, the Kremlin dwarf still had to maneuver, twist and turn, and take into account the balance of power and interests of various ruling groups. The Communists, the Union of Right Forces, the Yabloko Party, and other political groups whose names have long been forgotten even in Russia itself. So, let me emphasize. At that time, Putin still couldn't just bluntly order the deputies around like serfs, he had to negotiate with them as equals. Reluctantly, he had to compromise with the old elites from the Yeltsin era, while at the same time pushing his own people forward, those who, more often than not, wore the epaulets of FSB officers and generals under their fashionable foreign suits. But after the triumphant victory of United Russia in December 2003, an extremely obedient supermajority was formed. It was like a faction of the sovereign's loyal hounds. And there was no longer any need not only to listen to the Duma, but even to take its vital interests into account. And with each year, the degree of the Kremlin's influence on parliamentary processes increased, and the status of a deputy gradually became worthless, especially in the context of the fact that Putin was betting on strengthening the security apparatus as much as possible. That's why in Russia, being a general in the National Guard or the head of a regional FSB office was much more prestigious than being a State Duma deputy, and more profitable. Today, the State Duma is basically a universal printing press. It's a stamping machine for laws and other regulations that are written in Putin's administration. The most important ones are personally crossed out by Tsar Vladimir Tavrichesky, the less significant ones by the first deputy head of the administration, Sergei Kiriyenko. It is Kiriyenko, among all of Putin's Politburo, who is responsible for making sure the deputies obediently press the right buttons. They would gather not just on schedule, but also at the Russian autocrat's first call. Remember how it was with the emergency votes for the so-called incorporation of Crimea and other Ukrainian regions into Russia, for the recognition of the DPR and LPR, for mobilization, for granting the president the right to use the Russian army abroad, which in fact created the formal justification for the invasion of Ukraine by regular troops. Finally, I'd like to recall the famous phrase of State Duma Speaker Boris Gryzlov, who a couple of years ago was sent to warm a seat as the ambassador to Belarus. So, back when he wasn't yet a political retiree, he summed up the essence of Putin's model of power by saying, "Parliament is not a place for discussion. You can't add or take away from that. That's the heart of the matter." Putin's shamanic dances. Basically, you could put a full stop here, but you might have a perfectly logical question. Why even bother? Why does Putin need this kind of Duma? What's the point of it? Wouldn't it be easier to just get rid of these 450 freeloaders and use the money saved for the needs of the much-loved special military operation? which, by the way, has already started being officially called a war in the 5th year. Some people are slow to understand. To put it simply, the former KGB lieutenant colonel has something of an Eastern despot complex. He wants all the rituals and rules to be strictly followed even when they make no practical sense, as long as everything is grand and ceremonial. That's exactly why he loves all sorts of parades and other events, especially when foreign delegations are present. The people enjoy it and we won't be embarrassed in front of our guests. So, the Duma is part of this sort of Kremlin pageantry. Basically, nobody really needs it, but for Putin it's extremely important to observe all the formalities. The constitution mandates separation of powers in the Russian Federation, requiring a parliament. And even though everyone has long since ignored that constitution, except for the case when they need to show that Crimea and 4 Ukrainian regions are officially written into it, the Tsar still likes it when everything is done properly. The spirit of the law isn't observed, but the letter of the law is followed to the letter. Maybe this is also influenced by studying at the law faculty of Leningrad State University. Who knows? In old age, these kinds of youthful complexes start to show up. But seriously, the Duma isn't so much needed just to pass laws, but to create the appearance of nationwide support. When the deputies unanimously, or almost unanimously, vote for everything that was written by the scribes in the Kremlin, it kind of shows that the people's representatives are thinking along the same general line. That's why average Russians must think the same way, otherwise people in plain clothes might summon them for a little chat. This is how the well-known principle from Soviet times is implemented. The people and the party are united, only the stores are separated. No one will say the second part out loud, though. The State Duma is also the perfect propaganda platform for promoting the only correct narratives among the Russian elite, especially for such ideologically charged deputies as Kartopolov or the late Zhirinovsky. For the same reason, the Duma is used as a tool to test controversial, radical, or simply unpopular initiatives. In other words, the Duma acts as a legislative lightning rod. This works roughly as follows. Some deputy, usually a little-known one, introduces an openly frightening or repressive bill. For example, to reinstate the death penalty, then they gauge the reaction. The Kremlin assesses public and elite discontent. After that, they either put it into practice or, on the contrary, roll it back. If the reaction is too negative, the bill is postponed or softened, but only after the personal intervention of His Majesty. And then, in the eyes of the people, he once again appears as the good Tsar, in contrast to the greedy Duma boyars. Besides, the State Duma remains a sort of platform for internal squabbles and elite bargaining. And although no one doubts the Duma's total loyalty to the Kremlin Führer, it serves as a common venue where major nomenklatura, regional and business clans carve up second- and third-tier budget streams. Lobbyists, the military-industrial complex, raw materials giants, security officials, and agro-barons wage a behind-the-scenes struggle by amending the budget and sectoral laws, the results of which are recorded in the form of specific Duma votes. By the way, in this regard, parliamentary activity here can actually be quite real. It's just that it doesn't affect high politics in any way. And after all, the State Duma is a super elite club for the chosen few, for those who have been singled out by the Orthodox Tsar himself. After all, besides immunity, a deputy's mandate gives the right to receive many benefits and privileges that set him apart from other mortals. So being a deputy, especially a deputy from United Russia, is kind of a reward for loyalty, for faithful and diligent service. Take, for example, the most famous traitor from Crimea, not the sweet prosecutor, Natalia Poklonskaya. By betraying her oath and switching to the side of the occupiers, she spent 2 whole years proving her loyalty to her new masters. As a reward for organizing repressions against Crimean Tatar activists, she was awarded a ticket to Moscow's Artek. She spent 5 years relaxing in the Duma. But there, Poklonskaya was led astray, and after harshly criticizing Putin's pension reform, she was completely removed from the lists for the next term. She was expelled and sent to Cabo Verde as an ambassador, to a country that you can barely find on the world map without a magnifying glass. Of course, now she seems to have returned to Russia, but she leads a rather private life. So being a royal favorite is a thankless job and sometimes even downright dangerous. Elections with a hint of danger. And now let's move directly to the upcoming elections. At first glance, elections in the Russian Federation are one of the most systematically controlled processes even before they begin. Officials in the regions competing with each other to curry favor with the Kremlin do everything they can to ensure the necessary turnout and high results for united Russia. The required numbers usually range from 60 to 80%. The more backward and oppressed a region, the higher the percentage must be. After all, everyone knows that in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other major cities where people are more or less educated and reasonable, opposition sentiment is quite strong, so you can't just fake high numbers there. It's a different story in the downtrodden Russian countryside. There you always have room to go all out. In any case, if a certain governor doesn't deliver the results handed down from above, after the elections he's almost guaranteed to be shown the door, no matter how many praises he sings about his loyalty to the Tsar or how many portraits of Putin he hangs instead of icons. The Russian power vertical is not only corrupt by its very nature, but also a very ruthless system. Anyone who falls into its gears is unlikely to get out. Few who fell out of the Tsar's favor ever managed to rise again. Once powerful Vladislav Surkov and Sergei Ivanov are vivid examples of this. Therefore, it would seem that everything is under control, all overseen by the omnipresent Kremlin in the person of the already mentioned Sergei Kirienko, whose area of responsibility also includes ensuring the desired result in elections, and that's true for any elections. And if he can't handle it or unexpected problems arise, he will always get help from the people in uniform from Lubyanka. However, there are a number of quite objective factors that will make controlling the electoral process much more difficult than before. Why? Let's break it down together now. But first of all, these are the first Duma elections to be held during a full-scale war. Yes, you might say that 2 years ago Putin was re-elected once again, and he was re-elected quite successfully, with 87% to his credit. Well, first of all, Putin's personal rating, no matter how you look at it, is much higher than that of United Russia, which is often called the party of crooks and thieves behind its back. That's why the servants of the state have to put in a lot of effort to properly inflate the ratings of the dear United Russia members. And secondly, the domestic political situation inside the country itself is completely different now than it was in 2024. Every day, oil refineries are burning across the European part of Russia. Gasoline is being dispensed via QR codes. There are huge lines and fights at gas stations, just like in the best Soviet traditions. Along with constantly increasing internet censorship, the lack of prospects for a normal life, and most importantly, the growing overall fatigue from the war within Russian society. Against this backdrop, trust in the authorities is inevitably declining, no matter how sweet the words of the bought and paid for propagandists may be. Of course, specifically for these elections, Ukraine and the West will try their best to shake up the situation in order to cause internal destabilization in Russia. Moreover, everyone remembers that the first and so far the last opposition rallies in Moscow during Putin's reign began at the end of 2011, right after the State Duma elections. This is the so-called Bolotnaya Maidan, and Maidan, under certain circumstances, can eventually turn into real turmoil. The Kremlin might then be unable to focus on the war at all. Communists are in charge. However, even without external influence, the Kremlin may face very serious challenges during the elections. The main and obvious thing is that some of the forces opposing United Russia may pick up and lead the trend of growing war fatigue in the country. If not demand, then at least periodically call for stopping the war along the current front line, which Putin absolutely does not want to do. Representatives of Russia's largest opposition, the Communist Party, are separately urging a quick end to the fighting. Of course, you may laugh, but the Communists, even though they, along with the late Zhirinovsky's LDPR, were called a pocket or controlled opposition, can still spring some surprises. So, more than a month ago, State Duma deputy from the Communist Party, Vyacheslav Markayev, by the way, a Buryat by nationality, posted something unprecedentedly subversive on his Telegram channel. He essentially called on the authorities to present a clear public plan for ending the special military operation based on Russia's national interests. He also stressed that most Russians' living standards have dropped in recent years, while corruption has risen during the war. He criticized the leadership's inefficiency without naming anyone. And at the end of his speech, Markayev blurted out, "The country is on the verge of a social explosion, and all the responsibility for this will fall on the entrenched authorities." So the message here is obvious. The special military operation needs to be stopped and power needs to be shared. Of course, such an outburst can be called a system failure, an accident. But almost simultaneously with Markayev, another communist deputy from one of Russia's national minorities, Rinat Suleimanov, stated that Russia needs to end the war in Ukraine as soon as possible, because the country's economy simply cannot withstand the continuation of the conflict. He emphasized that further prolongation of the special military operation is impossible since about 40% of the entire federal budget is already being spent on defense and security needs. This not only hinders further development and investment in the economy, but also leads to rising inflation and a reduction in social spending. He said Russia's current economic growth is only due to expanding the military-industrial complex and increased militarization. However, military sector goods themselves have no consumer value, and therefore they are of absolutely no significance to the average citizen. Yes, of course, all this criticism of the war is mostly economic and even purely mercantile in nature, and the Putin regime is criticized very cautiously, without directly mentioning the son of sons. And the communists, of course, the current ones, the modern representatives of Marxist and Leninist ideas, do not shy away from having their own businesses and drive around Moscow's avenues not in Pobedas and Volgas, but in brand new Lexuses and Mitsubishis. But still, even for such a basic position, simply to stop shooting, quite a few voters might support it. And such trends in Russian society are evidenced by the sharp rise in the ratings of the CPRF at the end of June and the beginning of July. This rather unusual fact was even confirmed by pro-government media. But I don't want you to have any illusions. In the last presidential election, the little-known Boris Nadezhdin tried to pursue a similar line, whose ratings instantly rose against the backdrop of cautious narratives about the need to end the special military operation. But in this case, the Kremlin acted preemptively, and Nadezhdin was simply denied registration as a candidate. A party that is still relatively loyal to the regime is unlikely to be removed from the State Duma elections. Most likely, polite or not so polite people from the security services will ask the 82-year-old leader of the Communist Party, Gennady Zhuganov, to slightly adjust the rhetoric of his overly defiant candidates. And in general, to stop going off script locally, but even in that case, 225 deputies are elected not by party lists, but in single-member districts. And there, it's much harder to control the situation, especially since majoritarian deputies, regardless of party affiliation, are always more responsive to public opinion, especially before elections, because they really want to get re-elected. And there the topic of war and criticism of the authorities because of it will definitely come up, and more than once. Especially in the frontline regions, Kursk, Bryansk and Rostov oblasts, as well as in national republics like Buryatia, Bashkortostan or Yakutia. After all, it's no secret that far more non-Russians are dying in this war than ethnic Russians. It's Putin's hidden ethnic cleansing, and you don't even need Hitler. Our hearts demand change. Overall, unlike previous election campaigns, it will be extremely difficult for the authorities to use the current State Duma elections to unite Russians. Under today's conditions, they are more likely to provoke division and intensify the existing contradictions in society. All the more so because even in calmer times, consolidating and rallying anyone around united Russia was not an easy task. Let me repeat, the current domestic political situation in Russia is very complicated. A significant part of the elite, which is not connected to defense contracts or the security apparatus and therefore is not a direct beneficiary of the war, is objectively interested in its swift end. They are very dissatisfied with the continuation of the war and the Western sanctions associated with it. Now, even if you have millions, you can't live like before. You stole some cash, moved your capital offshore, and bought a Bugatti in Miami, and a couple of apartments in London. No, that's not possible anymore. Many top-level oligarchs and officials do not like the increasing isolation of Russia from the Western world and the growing dependence on China. Of course, if things take a really bad turn and united Russia's ratings keep falling while other, even completely unknown political forces gain popularity, the regime can always pull out a backup plan, rig the election results through electronic voting, or, in the old-fashioned way, manipulate them through the election commissions. Mass ballot stuffing in favor of the preferred candidate is still very much on the table. However, if there is a strong public demand for change and a renewal of those in power, and if one of the opposition forces manages to ride this trend, then a repeat of the 2011 Bolotnaya Square scenario where the protests actually began cannot be ruled out, along with accusations of vote rigging. And what about the war? Let's talk some more about the upcoming mobilization, or rather, its new wave. Right now, pretty much the entire media landscape is full of reports that, supposedly, right after the State Duma elections are over, in the last 10 days of September, or when the new State Duma officially convenes, that is, in mid-October, Putin will once again announce mobilization across all of Russia. It doesn't really matter if it's partial or full. What matters is that it will no longer be covert, like it is now, but open and coercive, just like in the fall of 2022. I'll put it this way. There are indeed objective factors that allow the good Tsar to take such unpopular measures. I have a separate video on this topic on my channel. A clear factor is the constant decrease in the number of people willing to sign a contract, even for huge amounts of money, while at the same time the number of those killed and seriously wounded is increasing. This is due to the expansion of the so-called kill zone at the front. Cheap Ukrainian drones have long become the main striking force in this war, minimizing Russia's superiority in aviation, artillery, armored vehicles, and manpower. In my opinion, the likelihood of mobilization resuming after the Duma elections is moderate. It's far from zero, but not at its maximum yet, and everything will depend on two factors. First, on the situation at the front. If the overall situation is not in Russia's favor, not taking the nuclear factor into account, then mobilizing a couple 100,000 of biomass will simply become the only way to plug the gaps. That is, Putin together with the general staff will first and foremost base their decisions on the specific results of the current spring-summer campaign. And secondly, a lot depends on the situation in the Russian economy. If the calculations show that there are enough serfs to support both the rear and the front, then mobilization becomes more likely. The shortage of workers in production can, if desired, be compensated by the mass recruitment of stereotypical Rovshans and Jamshuts, who are willing to work almost for a bowl of pilaf. As for the unpopularity of mobilization itself, Putin can actually use the Duma specifically to diffuse responsibility. For example, at the first session of the new convocation, the deputies, right after taking the oath, can appeal to the little father Tsar for mobilization to save the motherland. This trick, done at the request of the working people, will simultaneously create the appearance of the people's will and preserve the image of a just and wise leader. Of course, the future ratings of such deputies can safely be multiplied by 0, but what does Putin care about that? It's even better. The obedient boyars will become firmly bound to the Tsar by shared responsibility and the blood of ordinary citizens, just like mafia members are bound to their boss. In the tradition of The Godfather and The Sopranos. What's in it for us? Objectively speaking, the State Duma elections will not fundamentally affect the course of the war, since strategic decisions are not made in the session hall, but in the sick mind of an old man who only occasionally emerges from his bunkers to the surface and is almost completely disconnected from the realities of life. Therefore, for Ukraine, this whole electoral farce will only matter if there is a serious shift in the balance of influence among the various groups involved in the war within the new Duma. Namely, in favor of those who want to end the war more quickly along the current line of contact. If more Kremlin factions want to halt the special military operation even briefly than those pushing to continue the war to victory, the influence shifts. And to stir up the situation within the Russian establishment, even the communists will do. Nothing wrong with that. The end justifies the means. Naturally, no one will directly criticize Putin from the Duma podium. God forbid. It's life-threatening. But if calls for a ceasefire with Ukraine are heard more and more often, this trend will by definition undermine the monolithic nature of Putin's regime from within. It's a kind of death by 1,000 cuts tactic. In such a scenario, behind-the-scenes struggles and Kremlin intrigues may intensify in the future, which could hypothetically lead to a very real conspiracy. And then, if we're lucky, a snuffbox to the head. Well, you never know what might happen. That's all from me. Thank you for watching. Thanks to all the sponsors for supporting the channel during these tough times. See you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.